Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be reviewing the Sharks' 15-16 season. So, coming off of a pretty poor 14-15 season, Doug Wilson had said that there was going to be a step back to take 2 steps forward. That 14-15 season was viewed as said step back, and the Sharks and Sharks fans were seeing whether or not the 15-16 season, which had been built up to potentially be those 2 steps forward, would actually be something good for the Sharks. And Doug Wilson made a ton of moves in the offseason. First and foremost was getting that 9th overall pick in that 2015 draft, thanks to having missed the playoffs, and drafting Timo Meier. And while Meier would not have any effect on the actual main squad for the immediate future, so for that 15-16 season, it would be setting up the team for a good young player down the line. In terms of moves actually made for the immediate following season, well, Doug Wilson decided to fire longtime head coach Todd McLellan, who brought the Sharks to a ton of regular season success and even some, somewhat underrated playoff success as well, a couple of Western Conference finalists positions, but it was just never enough to actually get the Sharks to where they wanted to go. And so they brought in Peter Boer, who had most recently coached the New Jersey Devils, and of course in Boer's first year with the Devils, they had managed to make it to the Stanley Cup Finals in 2012 and were the team to lose to the Los Angeles Kings that year. However, they did put up a solid fight against them, lasting 6 games compared to the other teams the Kings faced that year, who did not last nearly as long. The Sharks also did some classic Doug Wilson wheeling and dealing at the draft, in which they got Boston to trade with the Los Angeles Kings, giving them Milan Lucic in exchange for Martin Jones back, and then having the Bruins flip Martin Jones to the Sharks so that the Sharks could get a starting goaltender, with Niemi departing in the offseason. Obviously the Kings would have never traded a promising young backup like Martin Jones directly to the Sharks, so getting it to work through Boston, who is in a completely different division, completely different conference, was a way for the Sharks to get a solid starter. It was a bit of a risk, as of course Martin Jones was extremely unproven, but of course it ended up working out quite well. And not only that, Doug Wilson made a couple of huge splashes in free agency, something he would rarely do, something he wasn't necessarily known for, but he ended up signing both Paul Martin and Joel Ward to pretty sizable deals. Joel Ward 3 years at over $3 million, Paul Martin 4 years to close to $5 million, and both of these players played huge roles on the Sharks in the coming season. Now, during said regular season, the Sharks were quite unremarkable. They managed to return to the playoffs, which was very nice, but it was a 3rd place finish in the Pacific Division. They didn't hit the 100-point mark with a record of 46, 30, and 6, and it wasn't necessarily a team that inspired so much hope in that they were going to be able to contend for, let's say, the Stanley Cup. This was a team that was making it to the playoffs, but was maybe in line for a 1st or 2nd round exit for most people's expectations. Now, in the regular season, in terms of points-wise, it was pretty good for the Sharks. At least Joe Thornton had a very nice resurgence season. It would, at least for the moment, go down as his final point-per-game season of his career. All 82 games played, 19 goals, 63 assists for 82 points, so very impressive by him. Then it was Pavelski, another 82 games played, 38 goals, 40 assists for 78 points. Then it was Brent Burns, who played all 82 games with 27 goals. He played defense the entire time. He was paired up with Paul Martin, a new arrival, as I said, in free agency, and that pairing worked beautifully to go with the 48 assists and 75 points. After that was a pretty steep drop-off. Marleau began his slow decline, continued his slow decline. He also played all 82 games, but with just 25 goals and 23 assists for 48 points. It was then Tomas Hertl, 81 games played with 21 goals, 25 assists for 46 points, and then another newcomer, Joel Ward, playing 79 games for another 21 goals, 22 assists for 43 points. Then it was Martin Jones as the starter. 65 games started for him, 37 wins, and some very, very solid stats. A 2.27 GAA and a .918 save percentage. Martin Jones really proved himself to be a very capable starter in the league. At the trade deadline, it should be mentioned the Sharks made a couple of moves. They managed to acquire Nick Spalling and Roman Polak from the Leafs, as well as James Reimer from the Leafs. Alex Stalock, who had been a pretty solid backup behind Antti Niemi, was not having a very good year behind Martin Jones. The Sharks looked like they needed some sort of relief in the backup role for Martin Jones, and James Reimer came in and filled that role beautifully, and it really gave Jones some rest down the stretch moving into a tough playoff season, I guess you could say. And in the first round, the Sharks were once again against the Los Angeles Kings. The last two times the Sharks had been in the playoffs, 2013, 2014, they had faced off against the Kings and they had lost to them in 2 7-game series. So they were looking for finally some revenge to conquer some demons in this first series. They were on the road as the Kings were the second place team in the Pacific Division. And in the first 2 games, while they were close games, the Sharks managed to come out on top and take an early 2-0 series lead. Unfortunately, the first game on home ice for the Sharks in this series, well, it was a loss and it was a 2-1 series. Now, it should be mentioned that this season, it was when the Sharks managed to coin the term road ice advantage. They were, I believe, the best road team in the NHL that year. So winning those first 2 games wasn't necessarily a huge surprise, but losing that third one at home was pretty disappointing. But the fourth one went the way of San Jose, and they took a 3-1 series lead into Game 5. Now, potentially the San Jose of old, the San Jose under Todd McClellan, would have folded at this point. I mean, the Kings had managed to come back from down 3-0. Why couldn't they do it from down 3-1? It's an even bigger advantage. And in that Game 5, it could have potentially gone that way. The Sharks did score 3 unanswered goals early, but the Kings answered with 3 unanswered goals of their own to make it a 3-3 score. And as I said, maybe an older Sharks team would have actually just collapsed at that point, lost Game 5, and who knows what would happen in Game 6 and potentially Game 7. But instead, the Sharks responded. They scored another 3 goals and took the game 6-3, as well as the series 4-1 to move on to the second round and take down the Los Angeles Kings. And that would actually be the final time in a series the Kings would actually win a game in a playoff series up until, well, the current present time at the moment, since the Kings would miss the playoffs in basically every other year, except for one where they'd get swept by the Vegas Golden Knights. In the second round, it would be the only time the Sharks would actually have home ice advantage in a series, and it would come out to play very, very well as against the Nashville Predators, a wildcard team who upset a top seed in the first round. The Sharks managed to win the first 2 games at home, but the Predators responded quite well. In Game 3, the Predators were pretty clearly the better team in that one, making it 2-1. And in the third game, it would take 3 overtimes before Mike Fisher would end it for Nashville to make it 2-2. Unfortunately, Joe Pavelski would score in that first overtime in that game, but it would get called back for goalie interference. We'd go the extra long time, and me on the East Coast, well, it went pretty late. But in the end, it was Mike Fisher and the Nashville Predators. Game 5 would come along and the Sharks would dominate it at home, but it would be Game 6 in which the Predators would take yet another overtime victory to make it 3-3 going into Game 7. And as I mentioned, in that series against the Kings, maybe the Sharks of old in that Game 7 would have fallen off, would have collapsed and lost it to the Nashville Predators. But not only did they win that Game 7, they absolutely dominated it. They made Shea Weber regret he had ever actually become a defenseman in the NHL, as they just exposed him very, very well. And the Sharks took that series in 7 games. Moving on to the Western Conference Finals, not uncharted territory for the San Jose Sharks, but they had never managed to win a Western Conference Finals appearance. And this time they were against the St. Louis Blues, a team who in the first round had eliminated the defending Stanley Cup champion Chicago Blackhawks, so they were also in line for a potential Stanley Cup run. And in the first game, while the Sharks played well, they ended up dropping it and going down 1-0 in a series for the first time in these playoffs. But they responded very well. The next 2 games, the first one being in St. Louis still, and this next one being at home, they rattled off 2 straight shutouts to take back a 2-1 series lead. In Game 4, Martin Jones would actually end up getting pulled, and the Sharks would lose 6-3 to bring it to a best-of-3 series in the last 3 games. But unlike against the Nashville Predators, where those 3 games were necessary, the Sharks managed to end it in just 2, with a 6-3 victory in Game 5. And in Game 6, they scored 4 unanswered goals, and while Tarasenko kept it interesting there near the end, the Sharks would win it 5-2 and head, for the first time in franchise history, to a Stanley Cup Finals. There, they would face off against the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, coming into the playoffs, I always like to do the NHL Bracket Challenge, and of course, out of the Western Conference, I would always put the San Jose Sharks, whether or not I actually believed they could do it or not. But this year, I had taken a look at the Eastern Conference, and I had pointed out the Pittsburgh Penguins. They just seemed to be an extremely stacked team that year, and I said, this is the team that's likely going to make it to the Stanley Cup Finals. And although it did take 7 games against the Lightning in the Eastern Conference Finals, that's exactly where they ended up. This Penguins team was extremely good, and so the Sharks were going to have their work cut out for them, and that they did. In the first 2 games, they were very, very close scores, but unfortunately, the Penguins just managed to sneak out with the victory, you could say, in the last few minutes of that first game, in which I believe it was Nick Bonino who scored in the last couple of minutes, and then in Game 2, an overtime victory for the Penguins. The Sharks would get their first ever victory in the Stanley Cup Finals in franchise history, especially there at home ice, with a Jonas Donskoy overtime goal to make it an interesting series 2-1 before a Game 4 would take the series lead for the Penguins 3-1. It would have some heroics in Game 5 by Martin Jones to keep the Sharks alive, over 40 saves in that one to make it 3-2, but in Game 6 it would unfortunately not be enough. The Penguins were just too dominant in this series, and they take the victory, they take the series, and they take the cup in just 6 games. And just to put in perspective how fantastic this Penguins team was this year, and how close the Sharks were as well, the following year, 16-17, the Penguins were noticeably worse on paper, as well as the fact that Chris Letang, their best defenseman, their number one defenseman, would be injured the entire playoffs and the next season, and yet the Penguins would still manage to repeat and win the cup. So just to put into perspective how fantastic the Penguins were that year. In the playoffs, the stats would go as followed. Logan Couture, all games played, every single one of these players played every single game, 10 goals, 20 assists for 30 points. I mean, Couture was actually in the conversation for the Conn Smythe, even though the Sharks actually lost this the Stanley Cup, and so that just shows how good Couture was in the playoffs. Then it was Brent Burns, as I said, playing all 24 games, 7 goals, 17 assists for 24 points. Then it was Joe Pavelski, 14 goals, 9 assists for 23 points. Joe Thornton with 3 goals, 18 assists for 21 points. Joel Ward, who ended up being a very good addition, not just for the regular season, but for the playoffs. As we knew, Joe Ward was a pretty clutch playoff performer, 7 goals, 6 assists for 13 points. And then Patrick Marleau with 5 goals, 8 assists, and 13 points. Martin Jones was fantastic during the playoffs, having some great series, especially in the Stanley Cup Finals. Basically the best player for the Sharks in that Finals against the Pittsburgh Penguins, having started every single game, 14 wins, just 2 shy of the coveted 16, as well as just fantastic stats, 2.17 GAA and a .923 save percentage. So the Sharks, it continues to be the closest the Sharks have ever gotten to winning the Stanley Cup. It really felt like a special year, but just unfortunately they ran into a completely stacked Pittsburgh Penguin team, and even though they did keep it relatively close on the scoreboard, it is pretty well known that the better team ended up winning that series. And so the Sharks would have to regroup in the 2016 offseason, but compared to the 2015 offseason, where hopes were very, very down on the Sharks, it seemed as though the Sharks had really reasserted themselves as a contender at this point, and we would see how they would do going into the following year. Class dismissed.